"She's an ex-con," Victoria said coldly, sliding the file away. "We don't hire people like you." Daniel stood still. "You don't know me." "I know enough." The doors burst open. "Ma'am," a Navy SEAL commander said sharply, "that man saved my team and your life. You owe him everything." Victoria Hayes stood at the glass wall of her Dallas office, overlooking the endless movement of trucks below. As the CEO of one of Texas's largest logistics companies, she had built her empire on discipline, control, and sharp judgment. To her, trust was earned through spotless records and proven reliability, not promises or explanations. That morning, her assistant had scheduled a meeting with a man named Daniel Carter. His company was small, barely noticeable compared to the giants she usually worked with. Still, something about his persistence had made her curious enough to give him a brief audience. When Daniel walked into the room, he carried himself quietly, with a calm confidence that didn't try to impress. His clothes were simple, his posture steady, and his eyes observant. He greeted Victoria politely and began explaining his proposal, speaking with clarity about his fleet, routes, and reliability. Victoria listened, but her attention shifted the moment she reviewed his background file. Her expression hardened slightly as her eyes paused on one detail: criminal record. The word ex-convict stood out like a stain in an otherwise ordinary profile. Her tone changed immediately. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms, her voice now colder than before. She questioned his credibility, his integrity, and whether someone with his past could truly be trusted in a high-stakes business environment. Each word carried a weight that felt more like judgment than inquiry. Daniel remained composed, though the tension in his jaw revealed the impact of her words. He didn't interrupt or raise his voice. Instead, he simply answered her questions calmly, explaining that his past was behind him and that he had spent years rebuilding his life through honest work. But Victoria wasn't convinced. In her world, risk was something to eliminate, not negotiate. She dismissed his explanations as insufficient and concluded that Horizon Freight could not associate with someone carrying that kind of history. Her decision came quickly, firm, and final. Daniel nodded slowly, as if he had expected this outcome all along. He gathered his documents without argument, his expression unreadable but dignified. As he turned toward the door, there was no anger in his steps, only a quiet acceptance shaped by years of similar moments. Just as his hand reached for the door handle, it opened from the other side. A tall man in a crisp Navy uniform stepped into the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. The insignia on his chest identified him as a U.S. Navy SEAL commander. Victoria blinked in surprise, momentarily thrown off balance. The commander's eyes moved directly to Daniel, and his expression softened into something resembling respect. He stepped forward and extended his hand, greeting Daniel not as a stranger, but as someone he clearly knew well. Daniel hesitated for a brief second before shaking his hand, a subtle shift in his demeanor revealing familiarity. Victoria watched silently, confusion building in her mind as the dynamic in the room shifted. The authority she had felt moments ago began to feel uncertain. The commander turned to Victoria and introduced himself formally. His tone was calm but firm, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being listened to. Without hesitation, he began to speak about Daniel, not as a businessman, but as a man who had once stood in places few could understand. He explained that years earlier, Daniel had been involved in a situation that led to his criminal record, but what the file didn't show was the full story. Daniel had taken the blame to protect someone else during a chaotic incident tied to a covert operation gone wrong. Victoria's expression shifted as she listened. The certainty she had held earlier began to crack under the weight of information she had never considered. The commander continued, detailing how Daniel had assisted in a critical situation that saved lives, including members of his own team. He spoke of courage, sacrifice, and loyalty, qualities that couldn't be measured on paper. Daniel had never sought recognition, never tried to clear his name publicly. Instead, he accepted the consequences quietly and chose to rebuild his life through honest means. Daniel stood there, uncomfortable with the attention, his eyes focused on the floor. He had never intended for his past to be revealed in this way. To him, what mattered was the present, the work he had built, the responsibilities he carried, and the future he was trying to create. Victoria felt something shift inside her. The man she had judged within minutes was now someone entirely different in her eyes. She realized that her definition of trust had been too narrow, shaped by numbers and records rather than the complexity of human experience. The commander finished his explanation and looked at Victoria with a steady gaze. He didn't demand anything, didn't ask for special treatment. He simply made it clear that Daniel Carter was a man of integrity, someone who had already proven his worth in ways most never would. Silence filled the room. Victoria looked at Daniel again, truly seeing him for the first time. The calm in his posture, the restraint in his responses, the dignity in the face of judgment, all of it now carried a different meaning. Daniel finally spoke, his voice steady and respectful. He said he didn't expect sympathy or exceptions. All he had ever asked for was a fair chance to prove himself based on his work. Nothing more, nothing less. Victoria took a slow breath, realizing how quickly she had dismissed him earlier. For someone who prided herself on smart decisions, this moment felt like a failure of judgment. But it was also an opportunity to correct it. She stood up from her chair, her tone no longer cold, but measured and sincere. She acknowledged that she had been wrong to judge him solely based on his past. It wasn't easy for her to admit, but she understood that leadership required accountability. Daniel didn't react dramatically. He simply listened as he always had, without seeking validation. His strength wasn't in proving others wrong. It was in staying consistent with who he had become, despite everything behind him. Victoria then offered him something she had denied before, a real opportunity. Not out of pity, but out of recognition. She wanted to work with him, to see what he could bring to the company based on his abilities, not his record. The room felt different now, lighter but more honest. The commander gave a slight nod, satisfied that the truth had been heard. He didn't stay long, leaving as quietly as he had entered, his role complete. Daniel stood there for a moment, processing everything that had just happened. He hadn't planned for this outcome, but he accepted it with the same calm he carried into the room. For him, it wasn't about redemption in others' eyes, it was about moving forward. Victoria extended her hand, not as a CEO asserting authority, but as someone offering respect. Daniel shook it firmly, a silent agreement forming between them, one built not on assumptions, but on understanding. As Daniel walked out of the building later that day, the sunlight felt different, not because his past had changed, but because someone had finally looked beyond it. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like something meaningful. Inside her office, Victoria stood still, reflecting on what had happened. She had built her success on control and certainty, but that moment reminded her that real leadership required something deeper, the willingness to question her own judgments. From that day forward, her decisions carried a new perspective. She began to look beyond records and reputations, seeking the stories behind them. And in doing so, she discovered something she had overlooked for years. The true measure of a person isn't their past, but what they choose to become after it.